right. Good mornings or afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Deion Hawkins. I am a senior editor here for The Reckoning at the Counter Narrative Project, and I am also an associate professor of argumentation and advocacy at Emerson College in Boston. And I will throw it to my colleague to introduce himself, and then we will get our conversation started today. Lance, to you.
Excellent. I'm Dr. Lance T. McCready. I'm an associate professor in the Leadership, Higher, and Adult Education Department at University of Toronto. And I'm also, mention a research lead for the Making Spaces Lab, which is sort of my research policy program development space, focused on issues of youth transitions and access. And I'm also a steering committee member for the Black Gay Men's Network here in Ontario. I'm in Canada, y'all, Canada.
Did you in the article they actually brought up recruiting internationally? But so
I
I know, right? I was like, that was a wild. So Lance and I both have the honor and privilege of being professors, and being a Black male professor is rare. But we're also here to discuss a New York Times article that was circulated earlier this year that we want to pick up as colleges are starting to return, getting back into the full swing of the fall. So in March, there was a New York Times article that really caught a lot of people's attention and went viral that reads, "At Black colleges, a stubborn gender enrollment gap keeps growing." And there's a lot of analysis, a lot of things in there. But one thing that became clear is at Howard University, where a lot of people consider very visible, prominent HBCU, only 19% of the students are male. So that translates to about 1 in 5. And there are kind of a lot of things in the article. I'll give my reflections first. I'll throw it to you, Lance, for just some key reflections, and then I'll nudge us to answer some conversations or questions, I should say, and then get into conversations. So I will say on my end, it was a very kind of eye-opening article from terms of the rationale as to why. So for example, for me, something that stood out was the fear of failure, or like the idea of not being ready enough as a driving force. And I think that is a very nuanced and important kind of distinction, because there's a difference between saying Black men aren't enrolling because they don't desire it, because they don't want to. That's a very different delineation than saying that there's a failure or like not feeling ready. I'll also say for me, what stood out also was kind of the need for community on campus. So I'm sure Lance can talk about this, but often in college and higher ed conversations, the conversation is almost always about recruitment. And very little about retention. And so I think the article does a really good job of saying, yes, there's a problem with getting people to campuses, but also there needs to be intentional thought about like what community looks like for Black men on a variety of different campuses. And I will throw it to Lance for some reflections, and then I'll give us some kind of questions to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you and just have a conversation about this issue and topic. Um, it's my interpretation or reflections of the article are also informed by being a graduate of Carleton College, which is a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, actually, even though I'm from New York City. So I went there in the late 80s and was one of very few Black male students at the school and in my graduating class at the time. And I also do a lot of research on access and boys' education. And so these issues and this phenomenon feels very personal. So first off, I'll say I'm glad that they wrote an article about it. I mean, and just to call attention and to highlight it, because I do think it's a dynamic and a phenomenon that has been growing. There hasn't been a huge intervention in it. It's not like it's, um, I think there have been attempts, but I feel like this gender gap between um, young Black men and young Black women in, enrolled in four-year university or colleges, yeah, it's there. It's persistent. It's not going away. So I was glad to see it highlighted and to have some conversation about it. I was also really glad, and I like the fact that they included a lot of student voices and their experiences in that. And I do think that, I'm teaching a class now called Young Adulthood in Crisis, Learning Transitions and Activism. And in that class, one of the things we talk about in the very beginning is that these crises and young people's experience of it, there's both a structured dynamic or a systemic dynamic and a personal sort of agency dynamic. So I think they talked a lot in that article about the personal and the agency piece. I'm not sure if we talked enough about the structural stuff, what's going on
Well,
about
let's
that.
start here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about that a little bit more then, because I do agree that it had a really good testimonies and use of personal experience. So, from your perspective, kind of what structures or systems should like we be talking about when we discuss this kind of injustice that we're experiencing right now? Because I do think that's an important delineation, kind of personal agency compared to barriers or structures that make it harder or easier for Black men to engage in higher ed.
Yeah. I'll say something, on the dramatic side, but I still think that K-12 schools, both public and to a certain extent private, continue to fail Black boys. Like fail them in providing them sort of optimal, good learning environments in which they kind of see themselves as sort of capable, confident, academic, learners, or also just sort of in life people who can accomplish things, who can sort of work towards their dreams and um, feel good about doing that. I think that a lot of schools continue to have really low expectations, like don't have their teaching together in culturally responsive ways that um, um, uh, give students confidence and esteem in their abilities, you know. So I think that's a structural thing. That's structure. That's a whole system. We're talking about the public school system. We're talking about private school sort of networks and systems.
So I agree, and I'll kind of pick up on this. So for me, this is really hitting at what the article kind of framed as like the fear of failure, because I think that's an outcome of exactly what you're saying. So if you have felt disregarded, absent, looked over from K through 12, the idea that you magically would have the confidence, knowledge, experience to engage in higher education, which is designed to be kind of more independent and autonomous, I do think is like an unfair expectation. And just, I don't, we haven't talked about that enough. So I agree. And I think the kind of author of the article, it gives clues to that as well. So you mentioned some cultural responsive teaching that could, are there other best practices before we get to college that you think people could know about, should know about? Like how could we be doing this better, do you think? And I'm happy to answer that as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'll another one that I'm beginning to do some work with a colleague and sort of longtime friend and associate, sort of David Lewitt Peart here in Toronto, is exposure to a wider range of career, livelihood pathways, including, entrepreneurial ones, including uh, the, you know, what some people call the education, um, health and human services professions like social work and nursing, and to a certain extent, coaching, uh, teaching, all of those that are sort of, you know, again, education, health, and social service professions that are traditionally seen as professions for women, that are more nurturing, which obviously then constructs sort of Black men as not nurturing or not capable of doing that kind of work. Um, so I think that that's one of the things, that there could be a lot more sort of exposure work through either mentoring ways or all job shadowing, just visits, because I think another sort of piece of that low expectations are sort of the narrow pathways, even, that young men could even go to university. In other words, it's going to be for something for sports. And if it's even going to be in sports, it's going to be in particular sports. It's going to be basketball or football, right? Maybe if we're talking about sort of first or second generation young Black men, they'll think soccer because, in other countries, in Africa and the Caribbean, or maybe like, track or something like that. But I think that they're really narrow, seemingly, pathways to university, and really narrow sort of outcomes from university. And I think that starts really early.
Yeah, so I'll agree with you, and I'll actually give a personal story that'll tie into the next thing. So, next thing I'll kind of have us transition to is talking about the need, excuse me, and desire for community once Black men enter campus. So, I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I say, even in kind of my experience, who was tagged from the system as, talented and gifted rather young, even then for me it was still almost always pocketed to be like a lawyer. And obviously a lawyer is a very great job, but I don't think a lot of Black men are ever exposed to the vast array of things. So, like, even if I were interested in law or critical thinking or debate, there are so many other ways that could be utilized outside of a lawyer. And I just think that I agree that internally, kind of in the community, we could do a greater job of showing. But I think that also requires schools, organizations, exactly what you're saying, like a hands-on approach. I'll also say that we probably won't have time to talk about this, but I find it interesting that a lot of the article um, seem to be about HBCUs in particular, where we know a lot of Black undergraduates are concentrated. But I would be curious if this is worse or better in PWIs. My guess is it is worse, as in there are probably even still less Black men enrolled in non HBCUs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a kind of transition to our next thing. So I am a product of three public institutions. So I've never gone to a liberal arts school. I teach at one now, but my undergrad was at Ohio State, my master's was at Marshall, and then my doctorate was at George Mason. And at Ohio State, now in retrospect, I recognize how different this was. So back in 2008, there was a program for African American males, and it was literally exclusively it was a National Resource
Mm-hmm.
Center for African American males. And a group of exclusively Black men, came to campus a week early to get acclimated to campus. There was a week of like programming, meeting the other prominent Black males on campus. And that was a game changer in retrospect, because One, I knew the other Black men that were there. So like when we saw each other in class or in passing, it wasn't a random hi and bye. It was like, I know you. We went to orientation, this stuff together. Two, now that I read this article and I'm thinking about it, it did an amazing job of showing Black men in positions of power at Ohio State, right? So whether that was a professor, whether that was a provost, and I just think that for me, that seems to be a good model that other institutions could do, because to this day, 17 years removed from when I did that program, it's still very vividly memorable. And I, to this day, stay in contact with so many people that I met through that program. So that is to say, two questions on your end, just kind of
Mhm.
what was your experience like finding community, and or like how do you see Black men navigating community as a professor now?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I went to Carleton College, this predominantly white liberal arts college, very highly ranked in terms of teaching and in terms of academic programs. 1986 to 1990. Some of those were the Reagan years. That was not sort of the height of equity, diversity, inclusion, and recruitment. There's some waves that if you look historically at colleges and university, like there's the wave in the 70s where I feel like they would just, some people joke about, they were just grabbing Black folks off the streets and trying to get them to come to these liberal arts colleges. There are pictures of like just, you know, 50, 60 like students like coming in literally on a bus. Um, and then my year, I think there were only like 12 Black students out of 400 and some. And yeah, there were only 12. I think it was half and half, young men and young women. There were no programs. There was an Office of Multicultural Affairs that sort of um, provided supports and some advising for students of color, but there was no programs. Later, I went back and taught at Carleton College, and they had started a Men of Color retreat. We had these things called Chili Nights where we discussed controversial issues. We did some more. I knew the director of multicultural affairs. He's still a friend of mine today, Clayton Cobb. And so there was a lot more programming and things. There was also a new thing called the Posse program, which is sort of a cohort program to bring students from underrepresented groups and from particular cities to these PWIs, basically as a cohort to create support. So similar to like what you're talking about at Ohio State, not all focused on sort of young Black men, but definitely sort of non-white and definitely um, um, there were more than one young man in those cohorts, and so there was sort of an attempt to build support there. So I think those are game changers.
So from what I understand about almost all of those programs too, the data does also support the conclusion that they work. And I can, again, anecdotally, personal experience, I can go back and look at the multiple Black men that I met during that first week at Ohio State through the center. And I can count on one hand the number of people that I know who didn't graduate. So it does seem to have a very clear, again, it's the resources, it's the network, the community. So I'm going to stay here on community. And then the last thing I want us to talk about is kind of the access and affordability aspect, because I think that's also an elephant in the room. But I reflected on this a lot, actually, on the community aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I want to talk about it more too. I have
okay,
something
great.
to say.
Okay, because it occurred to me that so I've been doing debate for a really, really long time. So by nature, a lot of times debate is kind of my community, but it's always not the most diverse, especially in terms of Black men. So there were ample times to desire connection externally. When I thought about this and like really intentionally reflected, I had to think to myself, if I were to go back to Ohio state, if I were to think about my time at Marshall, George Mason, so all of these are larger public institutions. Where I'm at now, rather small. Emerson's about 4,000, really different compared to the other places. If I think about those other institutions, it seems to be, in my experience, Black men found or sought community in very two distinct ways: fraternities and or sports, whether that be like leisure leagues, whatever that is, or just casual. And it seems that if it is not those things, that there is a very big gap in availability and or visibility. If those things don't exist on a campus or aren't centered on a campus, it seems that there is very little for Black men to congregate and gain community. And I was just curious to kind of thoughts and reflections on your end on that.
Yes, I'll say that, and then I have another sort of thought. Well, Carleton College, for instance, doesn't have uh, fraternities
Okay.
or sororities, and its sports teams, especially at that time, were they weren't. It wasn't like these powerhouse football team or powerhouse basketball team. There were a couple of Black players on each of those, but it wasn't like it was a ton of source of community or even predominantly sort of more Black spaces in those places. But I'll tell you what did interestingly happen at Carleton is I feel like there was a lot of community through music and the arts.
Mm.
Actually, we did a play. One of the experiences I'll never forget is we did a soldiers play that a number of um, Black male students were in. There was also a lot of the dance stuff, and there was a lot of some couple of people. Andrew Gordon was DJing, or we used to have sort of dance stuff that would include sort of Black male students, although it was dominated by Black women, but there were also Black men that participated in it. So I think that was a big thing. And then I also feel like in a way, for those of us who majored in African American studies or Black studies at the time, that became a space where Black male students would sort of meet and have some community. So, and there were also sort of informal things sometimes about where you lived and which dormitory you lived in and stuff like that. But that brings up another sort of thing. I think that we were not very sophisticated in talking about our differences.
Mm.
I thought that was, and that created tension. Some of us, like myself, identified as gay, and there was sort of teasing, harassment, sort of marginalization based on that, but nothing that was really brought out into the open at that time. Some of us were multi-generational, sort of, African American or Black American. Others of us were second gen, sort of from the Caribbean or Africa. Now you see a lot of times on campuses, it's just straight up sort of, first and second gen sort of Black students from Africa and the Caribbean primarily. But then too, we had those dynamics, but that often created sort of wedges sort of between us around that stuff. Not everybody identified as Black in the same way. Not everybody even wanted to identify as Black. Sometimes people leaned into their ethnocultural identity as being sort of Haitian or Jamaican or, Nigerian so I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity, and that I feel like is something that we do now better about being able to foster those conversations. But and that made it difficult sometimes for us to have community.
What? So I would agree that that's definitely likely gotten better. But if, let's say, that someone is like experiencing, or having this problem now, if in retrospect, what's something that you like kind of could be done differently, just to have the intentional space to have that uh conversation about the differences, or just kind of own that they exist, or what could be a
Yeah, and I've taken a particular position as a faculty member because I remember back then there was an open, well, I went not open, but there was a Black gay faculty member that was not very open, did not seek to provide sort of mentoring or um, explicit mentoring or engagement with other um, uh, gay, bisexual, queer identifying Black men at that time. And I always felt this person did end up becoming a mentor for me, but it was not in a very explicit or intentional way while we were an undergrad. It had to happen afterwards. And so I always felt like as a faculty member, I wanted to provide more leadership in that, like offer to facilitate conversations, offer some of my sort of experiences, um, teach a class to put some, you know, um, queer of color or, you know, 2S LGBTQIA plus um, resources, you know, I just wanted to be more explicit and sort of visible and there for as kind of as an example or I guess some people would say like say role modeling. So that's something I feel like that we can do and that should happen on sort of the colleges and universities is that we should be braver and just sort of be more public if we can.
Yeah. So I completely agree. I I've only had, let me think. Pretty sure I only had one black male teacher in all of my academic time, and I went to school a long time to get a doctorate. And so my guess is, if that's true for me, it's true for most people. And he was straight. And so when I became a professor, I'm with you. I was very adamant about being very clear and vocal about kind of all aspects of my identity and how that shapes my approach to the classroom, as well as the wanting there to be for people of similar experiences, right? I'm first generation in terms of college graduate, black and queer. And so yeah, that all matters. And before we jump to the kind of last thing about access and affordability, I just want to highlight two things that I think that you're kind of reiterating that are really, really important. Is so the article doesn't have time to talk about all of the nuance, but I think you're spot on in that when we look at like intersections and things, this even gets more complex. So like the black queer experience is probably very different than the black straight experience on a college campus. Where you find community, what that looks like, how open, how big that community is different. And I will say, I grew up in the Midwest, but for me, it became even more clear when I moved to the East Coast that the kind of diaspora does often have intersections that become important in terms of identity. So, for example, like I said, I live in Boston now. There's a huge population of Haitians, Cape Verdeans, Dominicans, etc. And again, like you're saying, I know for a fact that at many places they will construct a, African student association, Caribbean student association, because they feel sometimes that Black student association may not fit the needs. And so I agree that the intersections matter. Second thing, and we'll go to the last point, is this is for anyone listening, because I just wasn't aware of this as much when I was thinking about colleges. When you're thinking about institutions, not all types of colleges, locations, etc., are equal. And I wish we had those conversations enough. So even if Lance and I are Black and queer, my experience being at a large state school like Ohio State was probably drastically different than Lance's being at a smaller liberal arts. And I tell people, it's not that one is better or worse. You just have to know you and what you desire out of a collegiate experience, because that matters. And that's something that I wish people did talk about a lot more, because even if a Black male goes to college, if they go to the wrong type of institution or something like that, it could be, worse than not going at all, whether that be racism, trauma, or something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to hit that point, because I think that often gets left. People are like, all colleges are sizes are equal, types are equal. I'm like, that is not, it's not the case. Different scopes.
Mhm.
Anything you want to chime in on that before we kind of talk about access and affordability?
No, just that we do have to pay attention. I do think it's important to pay attention to how Black men support each other in the college and university environment,
Yeah.
because we need that. We look to that. Um, and things like that gets back to the strong gender equity agenda. I mean, when there's like wedges that are put because of sexuality or because of class, you know, there's still, folks talk about colorism or skin color, or the type of school or where you're from or accents and all those sort of things. Like, um, it sounds, maybe some folks sound sort of trivial, but these are sort of the kinds of differences and identities that become wedges for some folks, and like why they want to withhold or not connect with this person in class, or like not form a study group, or all of those sort of things, where I feel like I'm sort of um, whatever utopian or ideal about us. I want us all to be on campus, support each other, be able to discuss, acknowledge, and support sort of our differences, and just be, in brotherhood more than like try to create factions. I don't feel like we have really the time, or we can afford to do that.
I agree with you. And I think history would say that is true, that most impact or effectiveness that Black people in particular have been able to kind of maximize or leverage has required solidarity and coalitions. And I always tell people too, you don't have to be 100% in alignment to still have a productive conversation, or to still like fight for the same thing. So I think a lot of and because I could talk about this all day.
I know.
The big difference between now and like the movement of mobilizations of the 60s and 70s is that just didn't seem to me to be as much of the purity test, or like the idea that like you had to agree with me or you had to align with me 110% or nothing. It really feels like a white supremacist tactic, to be honest, like saying like you gotta all be in line or else there could be no solidarity. Okay, so kind of got a couple minutes left, so
Mhm.
I think it would be wrong to kind of talk about this topic without talking about the elephant in the room of affordability. So let's say Black men are aware of it. They have seen many Black men in kind of positions and they want to go to college, right? There still could be that very real barrier of how can I afford it? And this was alluded to in the article, saying, even if I know about it, there's a concern about affordability. And the article, I think, did a really, really good job of also explaining how the economic success of Black men in research is one of the biggest drivers of economic prosperity for the community overall. And again, it was eye-opening for me because when I went to Ohio State, I was blessed with a full tuition scholarship called the Moral Scholarship. And almost every Black person I knew that I met was on that scholarship. So again, I think so much of my undergrad experience I'm recognizing was so unique and different compared to the pattern that exists, across the country. So just thoughts on how we can make it kind of more affordable? I know this is different than what we work on because we're more in the classroom, but overall, are there things that you think people should be aware of, or that like we should be advocating for when it comes to affordability for Black men in college?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to acknowledge that, you know, Black men, we come, and young Black men in particular, come out of all different kinds of families, some of which are sort of middle class and have two working parents and, lead a middle class sort of lifestyle. And, if they go to a state or a public university, they may be able to afford that. Like, so that is the case. There are people in my family can afford to send their kids to. And then there are others that are really sort of struggling, and they're always I find with a lot of young people today, they're doing a lot of calculations about, does it really make sense for me to invest in this?
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that, and is this really going to pay off financially for me? And I think I just did an icebreaker in my class, for instance. I was like, what's your dream job? And a couple of people there were like, basically, they wanted to be YouTubers or influencers. And, you don't need to go to college, university to be an influencer. And so I think now there are more sort of representations and sort of images out there of folks that are Black folks, in particular, that are still not a ton of Black men, but still that are sort of achieving some sort of financial and socioeconomic upward mobility, and not through university, not even necessarily through sports or anything like that, or being professional athletes. So I feel like there's just a lot of competing narratives about how you can achieve some sort of prosperity, or economic well-being. So um, I think, my mother gave me a lot, talking about all the time about, like, this does not pay off immediately. It may not pay off immediately, but it will pay off down the road. And so that delayed gratification and everything like that is something that I feel like we have to continue to reinforce with a lot of our young people, that this will pay off. It will give you more flexibility if you get this degree. But you're going to have to invest some time afterwards. And I tell people all the time, my first job out of university was working at a toy store in New York City, working at FAO Schwartz. I did that for 6 months until I got my first sort of job in a nonprofit, and that was sort of began. But I was like, I worked in FAO Schwartz. It was a little humbling. I graduated my little psych degree, and then, I went to work at FAO Schwartz.
So that's why that you say it, because we actually and I teach argumentation and debate, and we just debated about kind of the value of college in this context. And yeah, I think you're spot on. There's one that competing external, right? So I think that there's YouTube University is a thing I always tell people, like, even if, there's so much that even before you could exclusively go to college, you only had access to certain things if you went to college. I think now YouTube, there's so many other platforms like courses, or, certificates. And so I think that some of it is also on colleges to figure out what that value is in a changing world. And also kind of students should understand that very little pays off. So even if you talk to influencers, some people get, good overnight, etc. But a lot of times, a lot of influencers will also tell you they've been posting, they've been creating for a long time, and it takes a while for something to hit. Um, and the other thing is, I'll say, because we haven't been able to talk about this a lot, but as more I got into higher ed, the more that I learned how underutilized a lot of like community colleges are, even if that's community college 2-4 year or wherever. And I've just been more aware of that in Boston, because Emerson kind of often has transfers from community college. And most of the transfers that I have seen have been Black, and at least 50% have been Black males. And again, for a place like Emerson that has a really low enrollment of Black males, that seems to be a really fruitful pipeline. So wonder if that could be helpful too, especially since community colleges typically way more.
Yeah, yeah. They have an extensive college system. And unlike the US, the goal of it in Canada is not to transfer to university.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
really more sort of career um, and job, vocation focused,
Okay.
which
Like
is
leaving with a trade almost, or a skill.
yes, or particular kinds of jobs. Like my favorite one that I think somebody got some college degree or 2-year degree around logistics, like just planning and logistics.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. They're not trying, they're gonna go work for one of these delivery companies or do logistics for somebody else. Like all this, that's you know, first that's something I've learned. That's something that has risen or like grown as a profession. Like all these Amazon and all these things we want to get quickly, and all these sort of like it requires logistical planning and management.
Yep, logistics and operation management. I know a former student got into that, pivoted to that, because their boss noticed that they were a good planner, and they were like, "Hey, have you ever thought about using these skills in a different way?" And so yeah, that see, but that's a perfect example of saying, when I was growing up, I never heard of that. You know what I mean?
No,
It's like giving black men so much more access to the laundry list of things that could be done. I think again, like this is kind of where we started, is
mhm.
really where we can one nudge. Is
Oh,
there any
yeah.
last things you want
Okay.
to?
I know we're going over, always do, but I will say, maybe we need to have a follow up to talk about. I feel like a lot of young men are under pressure to be the provider and the economic provider in the context of their families or communities.
Mm,
Whether or not they actually achieve that and have a lot of mental health issues around not being able to achieve that. I think it often drives a lot of the decisions that are made. The pressure and the role that Black men still um, are made to play as economic providers. And I think that's another thing that informs decisions about school and about 4-year university degrees, and sometimes what people in our community and sort of the you know, jobs or the workforce are saying. It's like, why you want to go get that 4-year degree when you could like be driving this truck and you could immediately start making money for your family, or like you just had a kid, you the baby daddy of somebody else, so you need to start making some money. Like, I don't know if you can really afford to like go to school and get some 4-year degree. Like,
mm-hmm.
you need to start working. Start cutting hair, start driving, start like do this 2-year degree, like try to do something in construction. So I feel like that's uh that's something that I know is informing a lot of how young men, and overall there's been a rise in the gig economy, like
Yeah.
that's a structural piece again. And a lot of young people being fed like ideas and narratives about what their place is in that and how that they could sort of be in that. So, uh, that's something different than when you and I went to school, because there was no like huge gig economy. It was like, there was more of that narrative. It's like a raisin in the sun, get in there, get that good job working for Postal, or get that good, get your 4-year degree so you can get entry into some good, stable teaching. That was a lot like, or something else. But yeah, I think we kind of have to navigate that.
Yeah, and I think, just to circle back, and then we can wrap it up. I think
Mhm.
that is an amazing kind of insight and assessment, actually, because it's one thing. So as we said earlier, the article kind of indicates that the economic success of Black men is one of the largest drivers. But what you're alluding to is that that can be true. But what we're not talking about is, even if that's true, what does that do to the psyche or experience of Black men who feel like they have that constant pressure to be the provider, and like almost feel like that has to happen immediately at a young adult stage. I do think that is a very different like nuance and kind of context that a lot of people don't talk about. So yeah, sounds like we should definitely have follow up. Well, Lance, any last things? If not, I'll wrap us up.
No, just I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that we get to have a follow up with any of the little sort of offshoot issues or debates that we have related to Black men, higher education, work, employment, identity, mental health, well-being, all of those things. We touched on a lot of stuff. So thank you very much.
I agree, and I thank you for taking the time. And yes, one intersection that I would love to go into that I have seen personally is even with that 19% number, that Howard, for example, I would love to know data about the breakdown of Black men in college that identify as heterosexual or homosexual or gay, because my senses tell me that there may be a concentration or oversaturation of Black gay men in certain places compared to Black heterosexual men. And I think that is often alluding to, like you're saying, is some of the kind of disruptions and things that we have talked about earlier.
We really need to talk about that.
Well, and we do, because I tell people there are some things, some conditions that I feel like have forced or socialized many Black gay men to flock towards education. But yeah, I think that's a
And I'll say, in my relations with other Black men in higher education, they often think that Black gay men are advantaged
yes,
compared to them.
I've heard that too. I've heard that too. So I would want to a follow up on that. Advantage would probably be advantageous.
Yeah.
Unpacking black gay advantage or privilege. Um, well, all right. Sounds like we may have our next topic. Well, for those listening, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our conversation. Please stay tuned and around. Connected with the Counter Narrative Project and The Reckoning. And thank you all so much, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.